Inside a WSDL. Welcome to Lecture 3 of Section 1. Let's begin. In this lecture, we will study about WSDL or WSDL and how to read the file. We will also learn about the various WSDL elements, namely definition, types, message, port type, binding, ports, and service, followed by a quiz in the end. What is WSDL? It stands for Web Services Description Language. Basically, it is a standard format for describing a web service. Also, how to access a web service and what operations a web service will perform. Written in XML, it also specifies the location of the web service. So basically, it is a file that has a complete description of a web service. WSDL is often used in combination with SOAP and XML schema to provide web services over the internet. A client program connecting to the web service can read the WSDL to determine what functions are available on the server. The client can then use SOAP to actually call one of the functions listed in the WSDL. So basically, WSDL describes a web service as shown in the diagram, and WSDL binds to SOAP, and the web services use SOAP to enable communication between each other. Now, how to read a WSDL? WSDL is extensible to allow description of endpoints and their messages regardless of message formats or the network protocols that are used to communicate. The main structure of a WSDL document looks like this. It contains a set of definitions to describe a web service. A WSDL document can also contain other elements like extension elements and service elements that makes it possible to group together the definitions of several web services in one single WSDL document. WSDL elements. A WSDL document has various elements, but they're contained within three main elements which can be developed as separate documents, and then they can be combined or reused to form complete WSDL files. Those three major elements are types, operations, and binding. A WSDL document uses the following elements in the definition of network services, as previously described: definition, types, message, operation, port type, binding, port, and service. We will be studying all of them in detail. Namespace. What is a namespace? The namespace represents the top-level container for the WSDL elements, including WSDL documents. Conceptually, it maps to the target namespace in the WSDL definition element, which helps specify the different namespaces that will be used throughout the remainder of the WSDL document. The use of namespaces is very important for differentiating elements referred in the WSDL. A given WSDL namespace can reuse its schema types, message, port types, bindings, and service across multiple physical WSDL documents. So hence namespace is an extremely important element. Definition. Definition is the root element of all WSDL documents. It describes the core elements of the WSDL language. The definition element defines the name of the web service. It declares the multiple namespaces used, and it contains all the service elements which are described throughout the remainder of the document. Here is an example of how the definition element is used. From the given example, we can see that the definition is a container of all other elements. From the example, we can also see that it specifies that this document is called Hello Service. It specifies a target namespace attribute. In this example, we have specified a target namespace of examples.com/WSDL/helloservice.WSDL. The target namespace is actually a convention of XML schema that enables the WSDL definition to reference itself. The definition element specifies the default namespace. It also specifies numerous namespaces that are used throughout the remainder of the document. All elements without a namespace prefix, such as the message or port type, are therefore assumed to be part of the default WSDL namespace. Types. Now we will discuss the types element in detail. A web service needs to define its inputs and outputs and how they are mapped into and out of the services. The types element describes all the data types used between the client and the server. For maximum platform neutrality, WSDL uses XML schema syntax to define the data types. WSDL uses the W3C XML schema specification as its default choice to define the data types. However, WSDL is not tied exclusively to a specific typing system. If the web service uses only XML schema built-in simple types, then types element is not required. For example, strings or integers. WSDL allows the types to be defined in separate elements so that types are reusable with multiple web services. Now, this code depicts how a types element can be used within a WSDL document. Data types address the problem of identifying the data types and the formats you intend to use with your web service. For example, the element name ticker symbol has type string, and the element name price is of type float. So type information is shared between the sender and the receiver. The recipients of the messages therefore need to access the information you have used to encode your data and must understand how to decode the data. So this information is encoded in the types element. Message. Now we will discuss the message element in detail. The message element describes the data being exchanged between the web service providers and the consumers. Each web service has two messages, input and output. The input message describes the parameters for the web service, and the output describes the return data from the web service. Each message contains 0 or more part parameters, one for each parameter of the web service function. And each part parameter associates with the concrete type defined in the types container element. Now let's take a look at the piece of code. Here, two message elements are defined. The first represents a request message, which is say hello request, and the second represents a response message, which is say hello response. Now each of these messages contain a single part element. For the request, the part specifies the function parameters. In this case, we specify a single first name parameter. And for the response, the part specifies the function return values. In this case, we specify a single greeting return value. Port type. Port type is by far the most important WSDL element. It combines multiple message elements to form a complete one-way or round-trip operation. A port type can combine one request and one response message into a single request-response operation. It can also define multiple operations, for example, and this multiple operations is commonly used in SOAP services. The port type element defines a single operation called say hello. The operation consists of a single input message, which is say hello request, and the output message say hello response. So this portType element shows an entire operation with one input and one output message. portType patterns of operations. Now portType element supports 4 basic patterns of operation: one way, request response, solicit response, and notification. Patterns of operation. One way. Now we will discuss the one-way pattern of operation in detail. The one-way operation is actually when the service receives a message only, and the operation therefore has a single input element. Request response. In the request response pattern of operation, the service receives a message and sends a response. The operation therefore has one input element followed by one output element. To encapsulate errors, an optional fault element can also be specified. Solicit response. In the solicit response pattern of operation, the service sends a message and receives a response. The operation therefore has one output element followed by one input element and an optional fault element also. Notification. In the notification pattern of operation, the service sends a message. Therefore, the operation has only one single output element. Binding. We will now talk about the binding element in detail. The binding element defines the message format and protocol details for operations and messages defined by a particular port type. There may be any number of bindings for a given port type. The bindings provide concrete information on what protocol is being used to transfer the port type operations. So, the binding element provides specific details on how a port type operation will actually be transmitted over the wire. Now, the bindings can be made available via multiple transports, including HTTP GET, HTTP POST, or SOAP. The bindings provide information of where the service is located. For SOAP protocol, the binding is specified as SOAP::binding, and the transport of SOAP messages on top of the HTTP protocol. The binding element has two attributes, name and type. The name attribute defines the unique name of the binding amongst all the bindings in the WSDL document, and the type attribute points to the port of the binding. For example, in this case, the TNS::hello portType port. SOAP binding. WSDL 1.1 includes built-in extensions for SOAP 1.1. It allows you to specify SOAP-specific details, including SOAP headers, SOAP encoding styles, and the SOAP action HTTP header. The SOAP extension elements also include the following: SOAP binding, SOAP operation, and SOAP body. Here's an example of how SOAP binding is used. The SOAP::binding element indicates that the binding will be made available via SOAP. The style attribute indicates the overall style of the SOAP message format. The style value of RPC specifies an RPC format. The transport attribute indicates the transport of the SOAP messages. The value in this example, SOAP/HTTP, indicates the SOAP HTTP transport, whereas SOAP/SMTP indicates SOAP SMTP transport. SOAP operation. This element indicates the binding of a specific operation to a specific SOAP implementation. The SOAP action attribute specifies that the SOAP action HTTP header to be used for identifying the service. SOAP body. This element enables you to specify the details of the input and output messages. In the case of Hello World, the body element specifies the SOAP encoding style and the namespace URL associated with the specified service. Ports. We will now talk about the ports element. A port element defines an individual endpoint by specifying a single address for a binding. The grammar to specify a port is as follows. The port element has two attributes, name and binding. The name attribute provides a unique name among all ports defined within the enclosing WSDL document. The binding attribute refers to the binding using the linking rules defined by WSDL. Building extensibility elements are used to specify the address information for the port. However, a port must not specify more than one address. A port must not also specify any binding information other than the address information. Service. Now, the service element. The service element defines the port supported by the web service. The service element is a collection of the ports. For each of the supported protocols, there is one port element. Web service clients can learn the following from the service element: where to access the service, through which port to access the web service, and how to communicate messages. The service element includes a documentation element to provide human-readable documentation. Here is the service element code. The name attribute provides a unique name among all services defined within the enclosing WSDL document. In this case, Hello Service. Service and ports. Ports within a service have the following relationship. None of the ports communicate with each other. This means that the output of one port is not the input of the other. If a service has several ports that share a port type but employ different bindings or addresses, the ports are alternatives. For each port provides semantically equivalent behavior. This allows the consumer of a WSDL document to choose particular ports to communicate with, based on some criteria, for example, protocol, distance, etc. Third, by examining its ports, we can determine a service port types. This allows a consumer of a WSDL document to determine if it wishes to communicate to a particular service based whether or not it supports several port types. This is useful if there is some implied relationship between the operations of the port types and that the entire set of the port types must be present in order to accomplish a particular task. Now, this is the summarized structure of a WSDL. It contains all the information in a summarized view that we have discussed so far in this lecture. We have the definition element that defines the service endpoints. The service publishes the port. Now, the binding is the class and the port type is the interface. The binding implements the port type. The binding describes the operation, and in turn the operation defines the input and the output. Similarly, the port type defines the operations in the interface, and the operation defines the input and the output messages. This is the end of lecture 3. Thank you.